you was waiting for is we have seen a description and explanation of the IDE-GSM model, and now we're going to look at some of the results, especially on the work that we have been doing for the Thailand Research Fund and the National Research Council of Thailand. So basically, what I will be presenting will be two cases. The first case relates to ASEAN and the various projects that ASEAN members countries have put in place. And then I will talk about some of the infrastructure projects that have been proposed by the NCPO, National Council for Peace and Order, which is quite interesting in terms of what they are thinking. So, just to refresh us a bit, in terms of doing this work, what is very interesting is that we have a model, but what is very critical is we need to have the data, right? We need to have the data so that we can input that data into the model. Thanks to the Thailand Research Fund, we were able to get the funding to travel to all the ASEAN members countries and to talk with a number of stakeholders. In each of the countries, we spoke basically with three groups of stakeholders. The first group are, of course, the policymakers, the direction where the country, that particular country wants to go, what are the plans. Then we speak with the private sector, various chambers of commerce, industries, the Logistics Service Providers Association, so that we get a better sense and we can also ask them to help moderate the plans that were done by the government perspective, by the government sector. And then the last group that we spoke to were academics, because academics are people who are more neutral and can give us some more informed decisions. So from these three different group of people, we've collected data and we have gone through all the ASEAN members countries. And it's quite interesting because, in ASEAN we talk a lot about connectivity, and we discovered that even airline connectivity to go to certain countries is not that easy, especially going from Thailand. So in terms of the structure, in terms of how we work, we basically, before we arrive at the simulation, we basically have two sides. One side is the side that we call supply chain redesign, which is handled by my colleague from Chiang Mai University, Dr. Apichat Sopadang, and he focuses on a number of supply chain, such as air transport, steel, textile, garment, electric and electronic, automotive, and also the logistics service provider, and to see how these regional supply chain may change, and I use the word may change, when the ASEAN Economic Community comes into play. Then Dr. Narong is working with another team where they're looking at the future in terms of using a kind of a Delphi type of approach. What is a Delphi type of approach is we ask basically experts in terms of how do they foresee the future. It's not an exact science, but it can provide you with some trends. And within that Delphi type of approach, specific projects are included to look at the potential feasibility, if they're going to be a reality or not. And then, based on the data from the logistics expert, the Delphi part, based on the data from the supply chain redesign team, then that's where we go into our scenario development. This is how we think, okay, what might happen, what might not happen. One of the challenges, when you have a tool such as a GSM, the first, I think, the first approach would be, let's try to do all the simulations that we can, and let's try to think about many different kind of scenarios. It doesn't really work that way, and we need to be quite specific in terms of the scenarios that we are looking at. Of course, we can do very specific scenarios, but I think that will also depend on the request from the various users. You know, if they're really looking for a specific scenario. But if you look at it from an academic perspective, looking at a broader picture, this is where it's important to have like clearly defined scenarios, not too much, because if we have too much scenarios, then we confuse ourselves. And then when we have the data, the result, then we can start working on this, what we call the meta-analysis. So it's an analysis from a macro perspective. And I think this is again where we have a lot of challenge, because when you look at logistics in itself, logistics is very much a micro level type of approach. You look at it from business perspective, what kind of logistics system should we have to improve our efficiency, our efficacy. But from a macro perspective, it's more related to the policy and how policy could be there to help improve the overall, what I call the macro logistics. So this is we've tried to explain the research methodology as simply as possible. So what we did was we collected the data, especially on the various logistics and infrastructure development plan in the various ASEAN member states. We had the data or the potential directions on what the various supply chains will look like. We also had this key document, which is very important if we want to understand the ASEAN Economic Community, which is a master plan on ASEAN connectivity. This is really the baseline document that everyone needs to refer to in terms of what is going to happen when we go into this ASEAN Economic Community. And then we compile the data, and then we think in terms of scenarios. So just to show to you the scenarios that we have done, we basically look at, first of all, the best case, and I'll explain further what the best case is. Then we have another scenario, which is the most likely case. Because as we know, we can always think from a best case perspective, but it never happens. So we have a most likely case. And then what we did was we've looked at the Thai case itself. Because we must not forget this project is funded by taxpayers' money from Thailand, so we need to answer Thailand first. But during our visit to the various countries, during a visit to the ASEAN Secretariat, one of the comments that came back was, we should also do it for the other countries. And I said to them, sure, why not, as long as you pay us. I don't mind. And I'm sure our colleague from IDE don't mind also. And we also spoke with ASEAN, but ASEAN, they're quite struggling because in terms of manpower, they don't really have enough people to come in and look at this particular work. And then we put in the scenarios, we go through the GSM model, and then we have the output. So what I will show to you are in fact the outputs. So the framework, just to reflect, just to show you how they interlink. Thailand infrastructure, because we are looking at it from the perspective of Thailand, supply chain redesign, infrastructure scenarios, and then we go through the IDE-JETRO GSM. But we're not using just the GSM. What we're also doing is, we always have this question in terms of the competitiveness. In our country, we are very much waiting each year when the WEF or the IMD publishes their latest report on the competitiveness. And what we want to know is, if these changes are done, if this infrastructure project or if this trade facilitation is being done, how will it impact the competitiveness of the country? So there's two levels. One is the economic impact, then the next level is the competitiveness. The challenge here is, because we're just looking at it from a logistics supply chain infrastructure perspective, we can only touch upon certain dimension of the competitiveness, and that, I would say, is a limitation. We cannot look at the whole picture on how like IMD or WEF looks at competitiveness, and then what we hope to achieve is these policy recommendations. one of the challenges that we have seen is, we can do policy recommendation, but at the end of the day, we cannot implement. At least it's not our duty, but we cannot implement. But at least this should be the starting point for governments, for policymakers to use that data and then think further. Think further in terms of implementation, in terms of putting priorities for the various projects, and also providing information for the private sector, because we need to work as a helix. As a helix basically meaning three sectors together, which is government, private, and academia, and moving together at the same time. This is a scientific approach to policy making, and then it's about looking on how you can improve it. So let's look a bit in terms of the scenarios and the assumption. The best case scenario is very, very simple. The first one is this. All the ASEAN members countries are able to implement the master plan on ASEAN connectivity. So that's the first condition in the best case scenario. Then, all the ASEAN members countries are able to implement their infrastructure, their logistics development master plan according to the timeline. According to the timeline that they have put in, they are able to do it. In the best case, we are also looking at the reduction in border crossing time and cost, because all the various plans have been put in place, both the hardware and the software. So this is the best case, best scenario. Then we have the most likely case scenario. How do we do the most likely case scenario? We do it through the Delphi, asking the experts in the various countries, showing them the plan and asking them, will it really be done on time? And what we have observed from the most likely case is that the projects will be done, but they will be delayed. They will be delayed, and we've observed that the range of delay is around 5 years. So it's quite simple for us to say, okay, if we go at the most likely case, we can delay the implementation for another 5 years, and that will impact on the results of the model. And then we have the Thailand-only scenario, which is Thailand is able to implement all the plan that has been developed, proposed by the NCPO, both the rail, dual track, high-speed train, Suvarnabhumi, port development, trade facilitation. But then the other countries in ASEAN are just implementing the master plan on ASEAN connectivity. In fact, we have another scenario that I'm not showing here, which is Thailand does nothing, and all the other countries are doing everything. Right? I call it frozen Thailand. Right? But I'm not showing it. I'm just showing if we are able to do. So if you want to think about the frozen Thailand, just look at the picture of Thailand-only scenario and look at the opposite, and you will get a better sense of what it is. So these are our three scenarios that we are working on. So let's look at the ASEAN logistics development scenario first with the hard and soft infrastructure. So starting point, Thailand NCPO scenario, this is the data that we put in. We have the best case, according to the plan, double track rail, multimodal, border facility, inner waterway, Lam Chabang port expansion, motorway, 4-lane roads, expansion of Suvarnabhumi airport, Bakbara, port development, national single window, and then we have the best case and the most likely case, which is basically a delay of about 5 years. So this is like the starting point. This is the perspective from Thailand, and this is the initial data. Then we've looked at other countries. I think this neighboring country is very interesting, which is Cambodia, right? They have a national strategic development plan. They've got a kind of what they call a quadrangle approach, right? That's what Prime Minister Hun Sen said. And they have this vision. Vision 2030. One of the observations that we've made in our research, and I've been saying this quite a lot the past couple of years, is that all of the other ASEAN member states have a vision where they want to be. 2030, 2025, 2035. The challenge, I think, from the Thai side is that picture is not clear at all. The direction of our country. So, when you think in terms of strategic management, having a vision is something very important because it gives you a sense of direction. And if you look at the various projects that Cambodia has put in the national strategic development plan, especially from an infrastructure and a software perspective. So you have the railway links, you have airports, you have ports, you have special economic zones, and then you have the national single window. And this data is inputted into the model. Let's continue our trip along within ASEAN. So you have Lao PDR. Lao PDR is interesting because they basically have two visions. One is to be the battery of ASEAN, okay, that doesn't really link that much with us. But then they have this other strategy, which is from landlocked to land link. And then there are a number of projects being put into place. High-speed train, most likely they say 2020. On the ground, it might be even later. Then special economic zones, Sawanakhet, Vientiane. Upgrade of route number 9, that has already been done, so that the best case is in place. Then you have facilitation at the border, Dan Sawan, but then Hue Sai. These are areas where you have facilitation at the border. Again, ASEAN Highway Network and the Thai-Lao railway construction linking into Vientiane, and then the national single window. So if you notice here, the various input that we are getting into the model, there's basically two sides. One side is the hard infrastructure, road, rail, ports, seaports, airports. And then the other side is the facilitation. And how do you reflect the facilitation is through the national single window. There are other ways to look at trade facilitation, but that's a tangible way. If it's implemented, if it's fully implemented, then you have results in terms of reduction in cost, reduction in time, reduction in the number of documents that are needed. Then you have Myanmar, where they have lots of plan, and they have a national transport master plan that has been put in place, which, very interestingly enough, reads like a shopping list, a Christmas list of what they want. The Myanmar Transport Development Plan is they want everything. And because they have been such a good member of ASEAN and the international community, then they go and see Santa Claus. So who is Santa Claus? Well, you have Japan, Santa Claus, America, Santa Claus, EU, Santa Claus. You also have Thailand, Santa Claus coming, and they ask for a lot of aid to do these projects. And this is where I think it's a bit challenging because, yes, they have a plan, but then it depends. A lot of this plan doesn't depend on just Myanmar. It depends on the donor country. The donor country in terms of which project they are going to prioritize. And the presentation made by Izono-san in terms of the why, no the why, small the why, medium the why. We talk with the people in Myanmar, they say the why is a Thai issue. So it's for Thailand to decide. You want to do a big one, you want to do a small one, Thailand, you decide. We're giving you the land for that. Vietnam, again, very interesting. Vietnam has now asked the World Bank to help them formulate Vision 2035 for Vietnam, and I've been involved in that work. So again, a lot of infrastructure project, high-speed train, new airport, coastal, deep sea port, road, and then the national single window. So Vietnam, again, a lot of potential in terms of these various projects that are being put in place. So we have the best case, and then we have the most likely case. Then you have Singapore. Singapore also is expanding quite a lot, not only in terms of this high-speed train between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, but also domestic line, but it's not for freight, it's more for passenger. Airport expansion project, the port expansion project, and then also facilitation. But because in Singapore they have gone through that national single window, now they're looking at more like e-freight, e-airway bills, e-documentation, even more e-documentation. And if you notice one thing, best case and most likely case, for Singapore there's almost no difference between best case and most likely case. So they are the ones who tend to be able to stick to their timeline. So maybe some lessons that needs to be learned also from our side. Then you have Malaysia. Malaysia, as you know, have publicly stated by the year 2020, Malaysia will become a high-income economy. And again, we see here a lot of infrastructure projects. The challenge, I would say, from the Malaysian side is you have East and West Malaysia, and the level of development is not the same. In West Malaysia, Peninsular Malaysia, there's a lot more development than on the island of Borneo. And not so long ago, they have asked the World Bank again to come and do a study for them to develop national port strategy. Okay, so this is something quite new. They have lots of port, but they're not very sure, and especially this part linking Peninsular Malaysia with Borneo is quite a big challenge for them. But they've got lots of projects, both in terms of the hardware and the software. Indonesia, with its president Jokowi, Jokowi is very interesting because he has stated publicly that he wants Indonesia to become this maritime nation, and they're looking at the port strategy. So a lot of infrastructure being focused on port, which is very understandable, with over 17,000, 18,000 islands. And they're also looking at the development of economic corridors. So within the country itself, you will have domestic corridors. So Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Bali, Nusa Tenggara, Papua, and then Kepulauan, Maluku economic corridor. So a number of economic corridors are being developed, but at the present moment, I would say it's still very much a very nice document, but implementation is still very much being challenged because this was part of the previous government, and then they have to rethink again. But it's something that Indonesia sees as very, very critical for them, and then the national single window. Just to give you some information related to Indonesia. In Indonesia, they use an interesting key performance indicator to look at the challenges at the border, which is at the port basically. They use a key performance indicator which is called the dwell time. Dwell time is the amount of time the container stays at the port, how many days. And the situation has in fact become worse. From an average of 5 days, now the average is 8 days. So last week, President Jokowi said, we cannot let this happen and we need to improve. But the problem is, you have both physical constraints at the port of Tanjung Priok, but you also have institutional issue, rules, regulation, documentation, green lane, red lane, and all these things, which is a very big challenge to tackle. The Philippines also have a number of interesting infrastructure projects. They got this pan-Philippine highways, but a lot of the work in the Philippines is also the connectivity between the various islands. About 7,000, 8,000 islands. Connectivity has to be improved. But if you notice one thing in what I have shown you, trying to go down each of these countries is there is a common theme, which is this IT component, facilitation component, which needs to be there if you want to facilitate trade. Then the last one, which is Brunei. Brunei, of course, relatively small, but the thinking is similar. Improving the port, improving the road connectivity, and then having this national single window. So we went to the various countries, we've collected the data, and now we have this big picture of what the other countries are thinking. And this is very important because we are going to be in the same community, the same single market, single production base. We need to be aware of what the other people are thinking and how will it affect us, especially if they are able to implement before us. So, let's look at some of the results. The first part of the result that I would like to talk to you about is these, what we call the policy and cultural barriers. This is the soft side. Infrastructure is easy. It's built, it's built. But the soft side is really something that does impact very strongly on what might happen. So in Adelphi, we basically ask experts in the region on how they see the future. We want to know the trends, the key trends. Some of you may have seen this. I think it shows the confidence, both from the government sector, private sector, and also academia. Look at this part first. This part is related to infrastructure. Basic infrastructure, road, airport, ports, electricity, and railroad. What we notice is there's quite a large sentiment of confidence that road infrastructure in the future will be better, airport will be better, port will be better, electricity, we'll have enough electricity and grid line will be there, even railroad will be better. But relatively speaking, and this is where it's interesting, the lowest confidence is with the railroad. And that's from a regional perspective. Road, I think everyone is very comfortable with road, with ports, with airports, even electricity. People do believe that rail will improve, and that's from an ASEAN, it's not just Thailand. It's from an ASEAN perspective, but still it's relatively less than the other modes of transport. Then if you look at the type of technology, availability of technology, and the adoption of technology, I think this is not surprising. In our area of the world, in our region of the world, we are quite good at adopting new technology, and new technology does come in very, very quickly. Dispersion, dissemination is very quick. So from this side, this is what we can say. In the future, yes, infrastructure should be better and we should have more technology, we should use newer technology. But, if you look in terms of these policy and cultural barriers, there are two sides here again, the PCB and then the government. So in the policy and cultural barrier, we ask questions related to customs. We ask questions related to corruption. We ask questions related to trade barriers and the quality of the regulation. The observation is this. If we think in terms of customs, by the year 2030, it should improve. It should improve a lot. Corruption should also reduce. So I think that's a good thing. Quality of the regulation, again, not that sure, but they think it will improve. But then this is what is interesting, it's a trade barrier. So even though we are moving toward the single market, single production base, we're still not sure if the trade barriers will be reduced. Even though it's in the plan, everyone has to reduce their trade barriers, but it seems like we're not that confident and we might have newer type of trade barriers. One interesting example, I would say, is neighboring countries who are Muslim countries where they have where they're now pushing forward for this what they call halal logistics system. Everything has to be according to the Sharia, and you have one country that is spearheading that, which is Malaysia, and then Brunei is also doing it. Last week I was in France, visited a cold storage place, and I saw the frozen food, and it was halal food. So I asked them the question, is your logistics system certified halal? The French guy said to me, no, we don't need that. As long as the food is halal, that is okay. I said to him, but the trend is going to change. The trend is going to change. And he said, no, it will not change. And then his boss said, no, it will change. Because then they will have to have separate room for halal. Separate people to handle it for the cleaning. And in Europe, 2 places are halal logistics certified. One is Rotterdam, a number of warehouses there, specifically catering for the Muslim community in continental Europe and then in the UK, because you have a large Pakistani, Indian Muslim community. So this is a trend, and this is what I'm talking about, trade barriers. It doesn't have to be just from the Ministry of Commerce or from a technical, it can be from other things. So we are not very sure, or the feeling is that we're not that confident that the trade barriers, the experts, that's how they see it, they don't see that these trade barriers will disappear. Then if you look at it from a government perspective, government efficiency, yes, there's this belief that it will get better. Policy making will become more transparent, and I think we need that a lot more, so that the community, the stakeholders understand the way of thinking in terms of doing the policy. Legal framework, in terms of settling the dispute, should be better, but then political stability, I think we have had a number of interesting examples. But what is, I think, the most interesting thing related to the government is the last one, wastefulness of government spending. Basically, the experts are saying it will not change. Right, so that's from the perspective of these experts saying, yes, we will still have a lot of projects that at the end of the day will become white elephant. These are just opinions. Of course, I think it's important when governments, policymakers see this information, it's about then how can you change the perception that all the projects that we are doing are making sense and we're using the money quite well. So these are the PCB, and these also have been included in the GSM findings. So the moment we've all been waiting for is the findings themselves. So let me start with the best case, because it's the easiest one in terms of the best case. So in the best case, just to remind you, Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity fully implemented on time, and all the infrastructure and logistics plan of all the other member countries are being implemented on time. So as Isono has explained, on the left-hand side, you have the graphical illustration, the picture, the easiest part to understand. And in the easiest part to understand, what we see is, yes, overall you have growth, and that growth is in fact located in very, very specific areas. Vietnam, Mekong River Delta. In Thailand, it's really eastern seaboard, and then slowly coming up, hopefully near here to Khon Kaen. Then Indonesia, this is Medan, Banda Aceh, Palembang. This is the island of Java. In the Philippines, the Manila area, a bit here in Hanoi. So what you see is that you have overall growth, but that growth is concentrated in very specific location. And if you look at the big picture, the country that benefits the most, if all the plans are implemented, everything is done on time, it is in fact Indonesia that gains the highest share, almost half, followed by Thailand, Myanmar, and then Brunei gains the less. So this is interesting. So it shows that if we're all able to work together, there's still one member country that gains the most, and really does gain quite a lot, which is Indonesia. So this is the overall picture. Now let's look in more details. Let's look at specifically at the case of Thailand. Which province gained the most? You look at the list. Samut Prakan, Rayong, Bangkok, Samut Sakhon, Ayutthaya, Chonburi. In fact, the provinces that gain the most are the provinces that are already quite industrialized, that already has a lot of industry. So that means they are able to attract and generate even more economic activities. But this creates a challenge. The challenge is, in this model, we are only looking at it from the perspective of economic impact, economic growth, economic activities. But if this is really going to happen, we need to think in terms of land use, urban development, how the labor that is going to come here, how are they going to live, mass transit system. So you have other dimensions that needs to be further considered. Because this picture will not happen if we still have like very limited accommodation, very limited public transport so that the workers can go to the factories and then go back home. That will become a constraint. But if it's not a constraint, so yeah, this is what will happen. And then the whole country wins, benefit, but not at the same level. So this is in the case just for Thailand. If you look specifically at industries, again, if you look just from the perspective of the automotive industry and looking at the impact because of the ASEAN members countries being able to implement all their plans, what you see is Samut Prakan, Samut Sakhon, Rayong gaining the most from being able to fully implement in the best case when we focus just on the automotive industry. But what is interesting is, like for example, number 10, where you start to see like Sarapuri. So that means it shows that we will probably, if we project it on a longer term, we will start to see this corridor being developed, which is basically Eastern Seaboard, Bangkok up to Khon Kaen. This is interesting. This is just up to 2030. Why do we stop at 2030? Because after that, the numbers, it's not stable. But at least we can see some trends where it will go. So if you are working in the automotive industry, you're looking at gross area, yeah, sure, being here is the best thing, but what about the price of land? You have access to labor. The future is probably here, along this particular corridor, where you have potential to expand for the part, for the components. Assembly will probably still be at the same place, but components, intermediate parts will probably expand even further. If you look at the electronic industry, of course, it benefits who? It benefits Ayutthaya, Samut Prakan the most, which is not surprising because most of the electronic industries, electric and electronic industries, are in that area. So this is just to show you that we can also look at specific industry and the impact of that industry on a particular location. So that's an added level in terms of looking if you want to focus on certain key industries. But if you look in percentage term, right, what I've shown you initially was in terms of the value and the share. Who gains the most in terms of the value? But if you look at percentage, Cambodia, in fact, gains the most. But again, that is not surprising because the starting point is less. So that means the percentage is high. And Thailand is, well, if you want to rank by percentage, we're number 5. It's 7.43%, which I think is quite a good number. It's quite a good number, right? From the baseline, you add another 7.43%. So this is something that can be considered, but that is based on the fact that all the countries, which I think is impossible, are able to fully implement the impact and are able to implement all of their respective plans. So that's the best case. That's the best case scenario. And the provinces, this is again in terms of GPP difference. So Ayutthaya in fact gains a more. But you know, this scares me a bit in the best case scenario. Why does it scare me a bit? Because my hometown is from Ayutthaya, and Ayutthaya is a World Heritage Site. And if it's going to be like this, it's going to become an industrialized province. Do we really want that? I don't know. Or maybe we want to do the World Expo there, I don't know. So yeah, it's a bit scary because then you have to think of the infrastructure in Ayutthaya to take all of these people to be able to have these economic activities to make them sustainable in that sense. So now let's look at the findings from the most likely case. So like I told you, the most likely case is the projects have been delayed. So in fact, the impacts will be less. So in the most likely case, what we see is the distribution is a bit better in terms of the share. And the country that gains the most are in fact Cambodia, Myanmar, in the most likely case, and then Singapore. Why does Singapore gain the most? Don't forget, most likely for Singapore and best case is not that different. So that's why they're able to go up and get a better share. So what does this tell us? It tells us that if we all delay, in fact the country that doesn't delay benefits. That's what it says to us. The country that doesn't delay benefits more. And Cambodia, fascinating because it gets almost a quarter of the share. Thailand, again, I think we like to be number 4, number 5 in the classroom. We like to be the middle student. So we're about 12.30. And if you look at the graphical representation, I think it's even clearer that in the best case, the areas where you will have growth. Here again, a very big red area on the eastern seaboard up to Ayutthaya. Slightly pink here, this is at the border, this is at Sadao, opposite Bukit Kayuhitam. Certain areas in southern Vietnam, in fact here you have a lot of industrial estate, and Khai Mek port, if I'm not mistaken, is here. This is the link at Babet Mok Bai, linking with Phnom Penh. So the areas of growth will be even more concentrated. So again, I want us to think a bit further in terms of, yes, this is an area where you will have growth, then the sustainability of that area, what it will look like is another challenge. And again, if you look here at the provinces, you still have the same group of provinces. Samut Prakan, Rayong, Bangkok, Samut Sakhon, and Ayutthaya. And it's really very, very concentrated into this area. So if you look at this area, be it in the best case, be it in the most likely case, you need to think in terms of, okay, what kind of infrastructure do I need to really support the sustainable development, the sustainable growth of that area, because it will attract a lot more people, it will put a big burden on what is already existing. For those of us who like to go to Pattaya on the weekend, we know, we see the congestion because of the port, the trucks waiting there. So I think we need to think quite a lot here, because it shows that if we have to do infrastructure, maybe priority should be here to be able to cater for this area. But then some other people may say, oh, development is uneven, we need other areas. Maybe we need a tunnel in Mae Hong Son to link. Yeah, but your growth is less. So these are some of the balancing trade-off that needs to be considered. In terms of GDP difference or the percentage growth, most likely case, impact on Thailand from the baseline is not a lot, 1.41%. But Cambodia still gains quite a lot. Myanmar, because they're not starting from very high, also gains quite a lot. But then the other countries, because like Singapore, like Malaysia, they have already higher level of GDP. So from a percentage perspective, it doesn't seem like they have a lot of growth. So again, here I think we have to be careful in terms of looking at the results. There are two dimensions, two ways of looking at the result. The first way is you look at the value and how that value is distributed in each of the country. How that value is distributed on the province and which area gains a share of the value. So that's one way to look at it. Then the other way to look at it is in terms of the percentage growth from the baseline. And in the percentage growth from the baseline, again, the challenge is the starting point for all of the various countries are different. So in fact, when we try to explain this, we have to show the two parts. We have to show the two parts and then moderate when we try to do our explanation on it. So it's just to help us to better understand what is really happening. Now the last scenario is the Thailand only. And I put in here 2.4 trillion. The reality is this. I don't really know now what is the actual amount. I am not sure because it changes all the time. But officially, as of October, when we try to look at the data, it's about 2.4. Okay? So we look at both railroad infrastructure, land connectivity, water and sea transport, air transport infrastructure, but very importantly is in this scenario, the other ASEAN members countries are just following the master plan on ASEAN connectivity. We do not take into account the national development plan. In fact, initially this wasn't part of the research that we were supposed to do because initially we were supposed just to look at the big picture. So just doing the best case, most likely case, and worst case, which means do nothing, is sufficient. But because we have this issue in Thailand, initially with the previous government, with the 2 trillion baht, and even with this government, we felt that it was our duty to also look at these specific issues and look at the impact. And this is, so this is the project, the various things that are going to be done, and this is the results. Baseline difference in the year 2030. So, not surprisingly, it's not a surprise. We gain the most, we benefit the most. Of course, because these are our national projects. We benefit the most. But what is very, very interesting, I would say, is here. It's Myanmar. So it basically says to us that if we're able to move ahead, and Myanmar still has delays, Myanmar will lose out because the investment, the growth will shift into Thailand. So again, from a strategic perspective, you have this first mover advantage. Anything that has been decided, if it makes sense and all the feasibility are okay, if you're able to implement it quickly, you have a first mover advantage. Because it will cost more to the foreign investor in Myanmar to do the same thing than if he was in Thailand, even though labor cost is higher. Is this connectivity dimension? Is this logistics supply chain dimension? Indonesia slightly benefit, Malaysia slightly benefit, but it's very much Thai-centric. But what you also notice is that growth is concentrated again. It's not for the whole. If you look at the provincial level, you have certain areas very red, but other areas are slight pink, and then some areas that are white. So that means there's very minimal impact on it. So let's look at the provinces that gains the most. What do you notice? It is still the same provinces. Samut Prakan, Rayong, Bangkok, Samut Sakhon, Ayutthaya, Chonburi. So it is still the same. So no matter the scenarios, it's still the same province that benefits the most. My question is this, is based on this, that means that we need to think in terms of, okay, how can we support this economic growth to be sustainable? So you need to look at all the supporting infrastructure, supporting software, supporting human resource development to be in place if you want this to happen. And Isono-san was talking about congestion in Bangkok. If I look at this, I think about congestion in the whole of the eastern seaboard, not just Bangkok anymore, and congestion up to my hometown of Ayutthaya also. So here I think it's a big question. Yes, there is growth, there is overall growth. If you look specifically at the provinces, that means the governors or the group of regions, they have to think further now. The group of provinces have to think further. If this is going to happen, what is the impact on them and how they can better receive. You look here in the south, this is from Hat Yai to Sadao Padang Besa. You have a new motorway here. Again, a big area of growth. How is that province handling this particular growth? In terms of percentage, when you look at percentage, it's nicer to look because everyone grows. You have a lot of, everyone is growing, and if you look at the colors, certain areas are very red, but it's mostly pink or even light pink. So if you just show this picture, it can be misleading. It can be misleading. So again, use the two and moderate them. You know, when you try to do the analysis, when you try to explain what is happening. But it's a nice picture. We are all pink, right? We are all pink, and certain our cheeks are red. So it's good. That means that the wine last night was good. So. Okay. So allow me to conclude, and then I'll open the floor for questions. If you look at the best case scenario, development, as you have seen in the pictures, very concentrated. Even though you are able to develop the master plans, various master plans, it is still quite concentrated. Why is it concentrated? Because you have an initial starting point, location, geographical areas that are already more developed than others, so they gain even more. Positive impact, not just on ASEAN, but also on our neighboring countries, ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6, ASEAN plus 4, Japan, China, they also gain from these best case scenarios. But in terms of the impact, because we look at both the hard and the software, the facilitation environment is very important because it can accelerate the growth. So Thailand has the second most impact in terms of the share, but then marginal GDP increased by 7.43%, but Indonesia has the most impact, especially in terms of the value. So if we look at a policy perspective, if we look based on the best cases, the condition needs to be made for the impact to be fully implemented, of course for the master plans, various master plans to be fully implemented, but focusing very much on the software aspect, which is the ASEAN single window. The software aspect, because this is something that will give you immediate impact. It's like a low-hanging fruit. That if you are able to tackle that part, then you can reap even more benefit from the infrastructure itself. And numbers of countries in the region, they already have developed a national trade facilitation plan. And I don't need to remind you, but the WTO has done this agreement on trade facilitation in Bali, and we are all supposed to implement it. That is going to be another big challenge, because from what Isono has shown, is that even though a lot of countries are members of WTO, it doesn't mean that they're able to follow their WTO commitment. Countries such as Cambodia negotiation for WTO was very quick, but still no changes, or not much changes. Laos very long, and still not much changes also. So this is something very important, that if we want to accelerate the growth, focusing on the soft aspect will give you higher impact. So this is the summary of what I was saying related to the best case scenario. So ASEAN single window critical for economic growth. In terms of the most likely case, okay, from the Delphi, when we asked them in terms of the delays, yeah, everyone agrees that we will have delays. Not everything will go according to plan. And a lot of these reforms will take time. Customs procedures, level of corruption, efficiency of government, this does take time from a bigger picture, I would say, within ASEAN. But one thing that these experts have said, especially related to the most likely case, is they're quite confident that road infrastructure can be built on time, or delays will be very minimal. We are very good at building roads, right, in the region. Airport, seaport, that's okay. But railway improvement, even though we talk a lot about it, but it's not really a priority because we start from quite far, especially in ASEAN. So when I talk about the railway, don't think that I'm just talking about the railway in Thailand. I'm talking about the railway in the whole of the region. It's quite similar. But then, in the most likely case, yes, a lot of the technology will probably come in because it comes from outside. It's not developed from within ASEAN. And then Thailand is a fourth ranking, and then marginal GDP increase by only 1.41%. But what is interesting is that in the most likely case, Cambodia is a country that gains the most. And we should be happy with our neighbor. You know, Cambodia is our favorite neighbor, so we should be happy with that because that will have a trickle effect back to us. If you look at the 2.4 trillion baht project, not surprisingly, yes, we gained the most, marginal GDP increase a lot, and then Samut Prakan Rayong has the most impact. But in this project, it's only about having these infrastructure in place. What is still missing is how do you operate, how do you manage the infrastructure? That's another question. Because here the assumption is that it is working. But if it is not working, what is the impact? Probably a lot less. And to encourage modal shift, well, having infrastructure or new infrastructure like rail or developing inland waterway, it is not sufficient. Returns, costs, many other things needs to be taken into consideration, total cost. So, yes, we have a policy of encouraging modal shift, but if you look at the budget is still for road transport. So, yeah, how can that happen? How we can increase the share? I think it is much more complicated than just having a new railway line, just more complicated than having new river port. And the recommendation is really, when you look at the plan, a lot of the focus is on the hardware. But what we are saying is that you cannot just focus on the hardware, you also have to give a lot more importance to the software. This trade facilitation aspect, formalize the trade facilitation aspect, more investment in that is needed. Through information technology development, sure, but then through the facilitation of trade, reducing all the various barriers and difficulties to trade. And then that goes to this concept that one of our colleagues in the room has been talking about. I've read in the newspaper about trading nation. So in order to be a trading nation, you need to facilitate trade and let the private sector operate, as freely as possible. Recommendation for the private sector. Well, from the results, development are still growth future is still very much concentrated and in the current area. So relocation is not that urgent. Relocation is not that urgent, but you will be slowly pushed out. So that means that you can stay at the same location, but in order to stay at that same location, the supporting environment needs to be there. Supporting environment needs to be there. If the supporting environment is not there, that's the moment where you will be forced to relocate very quickly. In terms of corridors, East-West Economic Corridor, Southern Economic Corridor, so that means Dawai, Bangkok, Phnom Penh, Ho Chi Minh, most area are the areas that are, I think, has a lot of potential if you look at it from a corridor perspective. And I would say, well, from the result, North-South, maybe because we haven't really looked at the China aspect in detail, but if you look just from an ASEAN perspective, yes, EWEC, Southern Economic Corridor, a lot of potential. And the next challenge, I would say, it's the skilled labor, because we need to think in terms of the development plan of the labor. Concentration, sure, but then how this labor will move, where should they work, where should they live, condition of living and all these things. I think this should be prepared before the investment being done. And last but not the least, right? So what might happen in Thailand, and if we look at the research finding, the work that we have done, is that, yeah, it can be like this. It can look like the nice picture, the nice rosy picture that we have shown, but that can only be done if we're able to strictly follow the plans. And I don't finish with a conclusion, but I finish with a question. So where are we now? So with this, I end my presentation, and I open the floor for questions, discussions, comments.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask a question regarding these slides 41 and 42, basically your last slides. The conclusion you all throughout your presentation is the most benefit that we can get is we have no delays, we act immediately. So you give here a very good summary of recommendations for the private sector of what to focus on. But can you please, because I represent the private sector, what can we do to influence the government? Because I think you're academic, of all the three stakeholders, as an academic you've proven that your theory, like we need to act immediately. Privately, we agree, right? We want to do everything as efficient as possible. So how can we, as a private sector, influence the government to take action now? Because, of course, we do our lobbying and everything, but is there anything that we can do to help get the most out of this?
Okay, thank you. I think we need to go to this concept of what I call the triple helix, which is government, private sector, and academia, on how, if you want to move forward, you need these three parts, right? You need these three parts. The problem is this, is that depending on the country, the weight is not equal in the triangle. In certain countries, the weight is very much, well, not certain, many countries, the weight is very much government-centric or public sector-centric, and the private sector has a lot of difficulty in voicing their perspective, their opinion. In many countries, the voice of academia is not even heard in the region. So for the private sector, I think to be able to come in and voice their perspective or to support some of these findings, you have, first of all, like the institutional arrangement where you have like public-private committees. So that is one way. But again, in the public-private committees, there's one member missing, which is the academia, to give this neutral perspective on it. So my suggestion would be for the private sector to work more with academia in order so that it's 2 against 1. Sorry, I'm public sector, but yeah, it's 2 against 1 to say, okay, this is the result, and the private sector said, yeah, this makes sense, and we need to do it now. And what are the difficulties for the public sector in order to implement it and see how we can help them in doing that? Because it's easy to voice what we want, and I understand the perspective of the public sector, because public sector tries to say, okay, we cannot just listen to the voice of one group or one particular sector, we have to listen to the voices of many groups. And this is where sometimes you have challenges, because then you end up having a compromise, which a compromise doesn't really help. You end up having this kind of status quo. That's why it is very important for any country to have a clearly defined direction on where they want to go, because that will be like the guiding light, so that everyone has to follow, be it the government, be it the private sector, be it academia, in terms of their role of supporting, in terms of proposing, theories, proposing scenarios, and then we can, all discuss about it and then come up to a certain solution. So, for private companies, if you are big companies, there are many ways. Of course, you can be part of chambers of commerce, chambers of industry, so that's one way. You can have your own lobbying activity, that is another way. But then the challenge is for the small and medium enterprises, because they don't have access to this at all. And in fact, that's a challenge. How can we hear them when some of these projects are going on, when consultations are going on, because it doesn't trickle down that well. Again, just to, I'll try to answer briefly, what should the private sector do? My simple answer is we should work more together so that we can present to the government saying this is from a scientific policy approach, development approach, this is what needs to be done. Private sector endorse, maybe provide even more details on what to actually do, what the private sector can do, and then present this with the to the public sector. But all of this will be successful only if there is trust among the stakeholders. If there is no trust, then it's going to be very difficult. We can always talk, people will listen, but then no action. So we need also to be able to build the trust so that the government can see that what the private sector is trying to do is also for the benefit of the country, not just for the benefit of the private sector. So I think a lot of convincing, but it depends on the country. If you go to Singapore, the government acts like the private sector. And if you meet government officials from Singapore, they have two name cards. One is a government officer, and then the other one is a company, where they have to sell certain expertise, certain software, or whatever. So that is something that I don't know if in the other countries it can be like that, but that's what I have seen. Maybe the model of Singapore is a bit extreme, but it is quite interesting in that sense. But again, in Singapore, do they listen a lot to academia? To some extent, but not everything. Thank you. Any other questions, comment? Director Anong from the Ministry of Industry.
สวัสดีค่ะ First, I have to admire what you have been studying and the progress of the result. However, I have a few questions. The first question is about slide number 22, and in that slide, you mentioned about Indonesia that have the highest GDP value result according to this kind of scenario. However, first I want to know the reason why, why Indonesia gained the most, because it's an island and it has like more than 100,000 islands, right? And related to that, my first question, the reason of the Indonesian gain the most is slide 2029. The most likely case that Indonesian become the least advantaged country according to this scenario based versus what most likely case.
Okay. Okay.
And another question concerning slide number 23 and number 30. Number 23 is about five bottom provinces in Thailand that will have bottom, their least advantage from scenario, and in that it has Mukdahan and Nakhon Phanom, which these two provinces are special economic zones according to government policy. So that is my question. And for the slide number 30, yeah, same thing, but another case, a most likely case, become Mukdahan and Nakhon Phanom as least 5 provinces, gain the benefit. So from these slides, what I notice is that the result point to the provinces that as a current, GDP gain, as a current GDP gain, doesn't have like benefit related to corridor that we have, north, south, east, west corridor. So provinces along that kind of corridor or even at the border of the country should have more benefit. But the result come out as Samut Prakan, Samut Sakhon, Rayong, Ayutthaya, which currently they earn a lot of GDP according to the industry existing at that locations. So this is all my question. Thank you very much.
So basically three questions in fact. First one related to Indonesia. Why does Indonesia in the best case come number 1 in terms of the share, but then the most likely case come at the bottom of the table? We need to go back to the master plan of Indonesia, because that master plan that has been developed, if it was fully implemented on time, would radically change the country with the 6 economic corridors, the port and everything. So we must not forget that Indonesia is the ASEAN member country with the largest economy and the highest number of population. So that means that if they're able to do that, then that becomes a catalyst for the growth. So that's why that number 1. But in the most likely case, and because of the challenge, like you said, Indonesia, 17,000, 18,000 islands. If they cannot fully implement, and it is delayed, it affects them a lot more. It affects them a lot more. So that's why it goes down in the most likely case. So the message for Jokowi is, please do it. That's the message for Jokowi. Because if you don't do it, a lot more problem. Because there's already a lot of problem. The more delays, the more problems you will have in Indonesia. So that's to answer your first question. Your second question, and I see where you're getting at, it relates to the border provinces. Why don't they benefit the most? I need to tell you this, is that the special economic zone are not in this simulation. It will be done for this year, because special economic zones are new. Then we'll start thinking in terms, and that's what Izono-san was saying, okay, what are we going to have in the special economic zone? What type of industries? And if you have any idea, we would appreciate having that data. What type of industry, what type of activities will we have there? What is the size of the economic zone? And then we could run the simulation, and then the picture might be different. It might change. So I think that's to answer your second one. Right. For your third question, related to the corridor, I think this is something that we need to understand, is that when corridors are being formulated, they tend to be formulated not based on existing structure. They say, oh, let's link from this place to this place. Let's put up a map and say, let's link from this place to this place. the corridors themselves, in order, and that has been always a challenge with economic corridors, is at the end of the day, they are not able to generate their own economic activities. What we have, what we call economic corridors, at the end of the day, we basically have just transport corridors. They are not real economic corridors. So that is why that in the simulation, when it shows, you don't really see it very clearly, and areas that are already well established will gain more. But, and this is the point I was making, is that these areas that gain more, like Ayutthaya, Samut Prakan, Rayong, Chonburi, if the supporting environment, the supporting infrastructure is not there, that will accelerate the growth of the corridor. That will accelerate the growth in neighboring provinces. But because we're just looking at economic growth, it is true that any area, any location that already has industrial activities, it will attract more. So that's the attraction part. But then, the more these industries are clustered, then you will have the negative part, which means that they will be pushed out. So that's part of new economic geography, like a gravity model, where it attracts, but then when it's conglomerate too much, then those newcomers that come in, then will start to move. And in fact, in the simulation that has been done, I think what Isono has shown is very interesting, is that, for example, for the automotive, just for the intermediate, if you remember the slide by Isono-san, just for the intermediate, what you see is that you start to see the formulation of a corridor, especially from the eastern seaboard up to the northeast of Thailand. The problem of that corridor is it's not a corridor that has been agreed upon. It's not the east-west, it's not the southern economic corridor, but it's a natural corridor. So again, here we need to look at, yes, we have economic corridor, or what so-called economic corridor, which in reality are not economic corridors. They're just transport, maybe logistics corridor up to an extent. So the question is this, is from the simulation, if from a policymaker perspective we say, okay, yeah, the corridors are not working well, then what should we do to make this corridor work? Or if we're starting to see some trends, should we promote like the eastern seaboard to Nong Khai corridor as a domestic economic corridor? I appreciate the question very much because it shows that we need to think further. We have just a result, that's fine, and then we need to discuss in terms of then what do we do? And if we want something to happen, how can we support? Or if we see something that we don't like, how should we do so that it doesn't happen? But one thing that we need to be careful is anything we do as Thailand, other countries are also thinking at the same time. So we also need a lot of more business intelligence for that. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? So what you have seen is from our colleague Isono-san, development of the model, then working with us and us, showing how we're using the model, how we're interpreting the model, and I think it's a good teamwork. We do work well together. Okay, so thank you very much for your comments, your question. I appreciate all of you for coming over, and I hope it has been interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Dr. Ruth and Mr. Isono-san from IDE-JETRO. After this session, we're going to have a lunch at Glen Bar, the first floor. You can go downstairs, and the restaurant is there, downstairs. So seeing you. Thank you very much for participation.